In 1987, a teenager connected a wire to a wall and entered a world that no longer exists. Before search engines, before social media, before most people had even heard the word internet, there was another digital world. A world built from telephone wires, the screech of modems, and the glow of cathode ray tubes in darkened bedrooms. It was called the modem world. For about 15 years, millions of people lived inside it, and almost no one today knows it existed. The modem world ran on a simple idea. If two computers both had a modem and a telephone, they could talk to each other. One computer would call the other, the modem would translate digital data into audio tones, and for a few minutes or a few hours, a connection would exist. No central servers, no global network, just a direct line and a community built around it. Connection sound lasted 8 seconds. After it, there was silence. Then the world opened up. The systems at the centre of this world were called bulletin board systems. The name came from the physical cork boards in school hallways, places where people posted notes and others read them later. A digital bulletin board worked the same way. One person hosted it on their own computer, usually in a spare bedroom or a basement. Others would dial in and leave messages, download files, and read what others had written. Simple, local, entirely human. The first digital bulletin board appeared in February 1978 in Chicago during one of the worst blizzards in the city's history. Two hobbyists were snowed in, unable to deliver their computer club newsletter in person. They decided to post it online instead. Within months, hundreds of similar boards had appeared across North America. By the mid-1980s, there were tens of thousands of them. By the early 1990s, there were more than 50,000 active boards worldwide. Each board was its own thing. A person called a sysop, short for system operator, would choose a theme, write the rules, and manage everything themselves. Some boards were dedicated to a single topic: vintage cars, science fiction, ham radio, local politics, chess. Others were general and welcomed anyone. The sysop was the architect, the moderator, the community manager, and the librarian all at once. Without them, nothing worked. Most boards were free. The only cost was a long-distance phone call that could run for hours. Phone bills were a real concern in the modem world. Calling a board in your own city cost almost nothing. Calling 1-3 states away could cost $1 a minute, and sessions lasted hours. Some users ran up hundreds of dollars a month chasing the best boards. Parents found the bills. Arguments followed. Accounts were terminated. It was a kind of love tax, the price of reaching conversations that existed nowhere else. Despite the costs, the boards grew, because what they offered was unlike anything else. Before the modem world, if you loved medieval history or astrophysics or rare jazz recordings, your options were limited to whoever happened to live nearby. The board changed that. Suddenly you could correspond with someone across the country who shared your exact specific, otherwise unshareable enthusiasm. The relief of being understood, of finally finding people like you, was worth any phone bill. You would dial in, wait for the handshake, and see 20 new messages waiting. That was enough. The interface was entirely text. No images, no colour in most cases, just white characters on a black screen. Lines of ASCII characters, the 128 symbols available in the basic computing alphabet, could be arranged into surprisingly sophisticated art, elaborate portraits, animated logos, maps and diagrams, an entire aesthetic of characters repurposed into imagery that no graphical tool could produce. This was a medium that made artists out of typists. Navigation worked through numbered menus. You pressed a key to read messages. You pressed another to post your own. You pressed another to download files. Each board had a slightly different layout, a slightly different personality. Learning a new board was like learning the layout of a new house. Regular visitors developed a kind of muscle memory for the menus they navigated every night, moving through the system faster than a stranger ever could. The download libraries were the treasure rooms. SysOps curated collections of software, games, images and documents that users could pull down through the modem at the speed of a slow trickle. A single game might take 45 minutes to download, but the anticipation of waiting for a file to arrive, watching the progress counter tick upward, had a particular quality: focused, quiet, patient, entirely different from the instant availability we have now. The speed of a modem connection was measured in a unit called baud rate. Most boards in the early days ran at 1200 baud. That was considered fast. A full-length novel would take nearly 3 hours to transmit at that speed. Users learned to appreciate brevity. The culture of the modem world valued precise, considered writing. Not because anyone mandated it, but because every extra word cost a little more time, and time was the currency everyone spent. By the late 1980s, network echoes had begun to appear. A message posted on a board in Seattle could be copied overnight to a board in Miami and then to one in Toronto. These automated relay chains created the first experience of something like a global conversation, but it moved in slow motion. 24 hours for a reply, sometimes 48. The patience required was remarkable, and people developed it because the alternative was silence. The largest relay networks eventually spanned continents. Volunteer administrators ran the routing systems from their own homes, staying up late to ensure their node was processing and forwarding traffic correctly. There was no company behind it, no funding, no central authority, just a web of individual people who had decided independently that this was worth doing. The entire global relay ran on personal commitment and nothing else. Somewhere in this network, for the first time in history, someone who was entirely alone was not. This was the part that changed people. The modem world was the first place where someone in a remote town could find others who understood their life, not just their hobbies, their actual experience of being alive. Lonely teenagers found peers. Isolated adults found colleagues. People going through the same obscure illness found others who knew exactly what it felt like. Long before the language for these things existed, the modem world built support structures around them. Friendships formed across thousands of miles that lasted decades. Some became romances. Some became marriages. People who met through the static of a dial-up connection in 1989 are still in each other's lives today. What looked, from the outside, like a teenager staring at a glowing screen late at night was often something more significant. A person finding, for the first time, a community that accepted them completely. Networks emerged around every kind of human experience. The modem world was not one community. It was hundreds of thousands of communities running in parallel, each with its own culture and history. A researcher who wanted to understand its full scope today would need to reconstruct it from fragments. Scattered backups, personal memories, and the occasional surviving archive, because almost none of it was deliberately documented at the time. In the late 1980s, a network of bulletin boards appeared that was built specifically for Black Americans. It carried discussions that were rarely welcomed in the predominantly white spaces of the broader modem world. Black history, Black literature, Black community news, experiences of racism, strategies for navigating a world that often preferred to ignore these conversations. It was a digital home for a community that had been underserved by every mainstream medium before it. Other networks offered something similar for gay and lesbian users at a moment when that identity was still criminalized in many states and widely stigmatized everywhere. Before any mainstream publication would acknowledge that such people existed online, these boards had active daily conversations. People came out in those message threads. People asked questions they had never been able to ask before. The safety of the text-only anonymous screen made possible what face-to-face conversation could not. Some of these communities were the only safe spaces their members had ever known. That was not a small thing. A dedicated bulletin board network carried medical information, legal resources, and personal support during the AIDS crisis at its height. Patients were often isolated, denied information, and turned away by institutions meant to help them. Into this void came information distributed through modems. People with no other way to find current, accurate guidance found it through a phone line. In some cases, the information they downloaded quite literally saved their lives. These communities existed in a kind of deliberate obscurity. Their members were not advertising their presence. The boards were listed on known directories but rarely promoted. The people who found them were often the people who most urgently needed to. Word of mouth spread through the channels of the community itself. A friend would pass a phone number along. You would dial. You would find yourself, without warning, in the middle of a conversation that had been going on for years. A separate subculture operated by entirely different rules. Boards dedicated to technical exploration ran on the fringes of everything else. Rarely listed, rarely discussed openly, accessible only to those who knew where to look. These boards carried a culture of curiosity about systems that were designed to be opaque. The people there were not, for the most part, trying to cause harm. They were trying to understand how everything worked, and they were very good at it. The aesthetic of these boards was carefully cultivated. Names were chosen for mystery. Access was earned through demonstrated knowledge, not simply requested. The graphics, built from characters arranged into elaborate banners and logos, were aggressive and vivid. A visual language that communicated attitude before a single word of content was read. This was a culture that understood, years before anyone else, that visual design is a form of authority. Software moved through the modem world in distinct layers. A program would appear first on a handful of elite boards, visible only to established members. Then it would migrate outward, to mid-level boards, then to general boards accessible to almost anyone. By the time it reached the outermost layer, the inner circle had already moved on to something new. This was a supply chain with no warehouse, no trucks, and no official participants of any kind. The environmental and peace movements of the late 1980s built their own corner of the modern world. Networks carried organising materials, campaign strategies, and news reports that mainstream media was ignoring. For the first time, activists in different cities could coordinate on the same schedule without expensive calls. A message posted in the morning could reach 50 cities by midnight. The political potential of network communication was understood by these communities long before anyone in power had noticed it. No one owned the network. No company ran it. No government had approved it. It simply existed. There were game boards dedicated entirely to play. Multiplayer text adventures ran continuously on dedicated systems, allowing dozens of players to navigate the same virtual world simultaneously. You would move through rooms described in plain text, encounter other characters played by real people, solve puzzles, accumulate items, and build reputations that followed you across sessions. These were the first massively shared virtual worlds. They were entirely imaginary. They felt entirely real. A player who spent years on a single text world developed relationships with other regulars the way anyone develops relationships with people they see daily. The characters they played accumulated histories, the items found, the challenges completed, the alliances made. When a player left, their absence was noticed. When a long-absent player returned, it was celebrated. These were communities with genuine emotional stakes, built on nothing but text and shared imagination. The people who built these virtual worlds developed the first rules for governing online communities: what behaviour was acceptable, how to handle disputes, how to absorb new members who did not yet know the culture. These problems had never been solved before. The solutions they found became the template for every online community that followed, whether those later communities knew it or not. And in 1993, something began to change. The modern world could sense it before it understood it. The World Wide Web had existed in limited form since 1991, but most people in the modern world were barely aware of it. Their world was already complete. It had its own geography, its own culture, its own social hierarchies. Why would they need something new? Then flat-rate consumer internet access began to spread. New users arrived in millions. Almost none of them came through the modern world, and almost none of them knew it was there. The new users did not know the etiquette of the bulletin board. They did not know how to read a community through its text aesthetic. They did not understand the slow rhythm of a world that moved in 24-hour relay cycles. They arrived in enormous numbers all at once, and existing communities had no way to absorb the change. The experience was described, at the time, as a perpetual September that never ended. The web offered images, colours and sound. The old text world had no answer for that. Bulletin board operators began making the calculation. The web offered a larger audience. It offered easier access. It offered graphics and multimedia that no modem board could match. One by one, sysops moved their communities to the new medium or simply closed their boards entirely. The phone numbers that had been active for years went silent. The hand-copied lists of board numbers that users passed around like treasure maps became out of date overnight. The modem world was dying. The closure of a board was often abrupt. A sysop would post a final message, sometimes heartfelt, sometimes brief, and then the system would go offline. The phone number would stop connecting. The files, the message archives, the years of conversation, all of it would simply stop being accessible. There was no standard format for preservation. Most sysops knew of no archive to consult. When a board went down, its contents usually went with it. Between 1994 and 1998, tens of thousands of boards went offline. The conversations went with them. The losses were not just technical, they were human. The threads that had carried years of community discussion, the boards where people had come out in text to strangers who became friends, the medical archives whose content represented hard-won knowledge from a crisis the mainstream world had refused to document properly. All of this existed only in the memory of the people who had been there and on aging magnetic storage that no one had yet thought to read. The storage media were the problem. Boards ran on hardware of their era. Computers with drives already considered obsolete. A sysop who wanted to preserve their board's contents faced the immediate challenge that machines capable of reading that storage were increasingly hard to find. The knowledge was there in magnetic form, on shelves and in boxes. The means to access it was quietly disappearing. Magnetic storage degrades over time. Particles that encode information on a disk surface slowly lose alignment over years and decades. A disk that worked perfectly in 1989 might fail entirely by 2005. And even before physical failure, the formats become inaccessible. The specific software needed to interpret the data stops being maintained, stops running on any current hardware. The content survives in physical form while becoming unreachable in every practical sense. The data is present, the reader is gone. The phenomenon has a name: bit rot. The gradual degradation of digital data through the decay of storage media, the obsolescence of formats, and the disappearance of the software needed to interpret them. Physical artifacts survive in ways digital ones do not. A clay tablet from 3,000 years ago can still be read. A data format from 40 years ago sometimes cannot. The most permanent form of storage we ever invented is, in some ways, the most fragile. By the year 2000, the modem world was largely gone. The text-based virtual worlds had scattered or disbanded. Specialty networks had migrated to web forums, where new participants arrived with none of the shared history that made the original communities feel like home. What had taken 15 years to build had been dismantled in 5. The architecture remained in storage, but the life inside it had moved on. The irony was difficult to ignore. A culture that had pioneered networked community, built the first global support networks for marginalised groups, and spent 15 years solving the problems of online conversation. This culture had left almost no trace for the billions who came after it. The foundation was invisible because no one had thought to preserve it before building on top of it. Somewhere, in basements and storage units and forgotten rooms, the drives were still holding on, or they were not. The estimate of what was lost is difficult to make because almost no one was counting. Hundreds of thousands of active boards existed at the peak of the modem world. Each carried anywhere from a few hundred to tens of thousands of messages. The original conversations of the internet's first human communities. Arguments about music, confessions of loneliness, technical breakthroughs, jokes shared with strangers in darkened rooms, exist now only in the recollections of those who were there. The software libraries are partially preserved, scattered across archival projects of varying completeness. But the message archives, the conversations themselves, are almost entirely gone. A message posted in 1988 in a community of 200 regular users, discussing something that mattered deeply to all of them, is simply not recoverable. It ended when the board closed. It was never designed to be permanent. No one had imagined anyone would want to look back. What we lost was not just data. It was the texture of daily life for an entire generation of people. There were artists in the Modem world, people who spent hundreds of hours creating elaborate works in text characters, portraits, scenes, animations, that existed only in the format of a specific terminal display. When the boards that hosted them went offline, the works went too. Some were copied to personal discs by their creators, most were not. The first major movement of native digital art created specifically for the digital medium, vanished almost completely before anyone thought to preserve it. There were writers. Long-form serial stories posted episode by episode across weeks and months. Communities of readers who followed them argued about character motivations, predicted endings. These were the first online fan communities built around original works that existed nowhere else. The writers often had no idea they were doing something significant. They were just telling stories to people who were listening. When the boards closed, the stories ended mid-sentence, and the readers dispersed. Some survivors kept their old discs for decades. They could not say why. They simply could not let go. Occasionally, something surfaces. A box of old discs discovered during a house move, a hard drive from a machine that stopped being used in 1995 but was never discarded. The data is often still there, waiting. Extracting it requires hardware that barely exists, drive controllers and machines running operating systems long abandoned. But sometimes it works, and sometimes what comes out is extraordinary. In one recovered archive, researchers found an unbroken message thread spanning 4 years, the same participants returning week after week, discussing the same evolving questions about a shared passion. You could read the entire arc, the way ideas developed, the way relationships formed, the way the community learned to talk to itself. It was like finding an intact fossil of something that should not have survived. In another, a CISOP backed up their entire board on the last day before closing, not knowing if anyone would ever read it. They simply felt the work deserved to be kept. The backup sat on a shelf for 22 years. When it was finally read, it contained the records of a community no historian had ever documented. A detailed daily account of ordinary life in a specific city during a specific decade. A small community of researchers began to understand what had been lost. They started looking for it. The recovery work requires a specific kind of patience. You track down the people who ran boards 3 decades ago. CISOPs who may or may not have kept backups. Some have nothing, some do not remember those years clearly. But some, when you explain what you are looking for, go very quiet. And then they tell you to wait while they check the storage room. That is when the work gets interesting. The physical recovery process involves hardware that most repair shops no longer stock, vintage drive controllers, machines running operating systems long abandoned. The data, when it finally loads, arrives in formats requiring specialist tools to interpret. Each step demands a different skill. The patience of an archivist, the knowledge of an engineer, and the instincts of someone who can recognize when a disk is about to fail permanently. Sometimes the disk loads, the cursor blinks, and 40 years of conversation appear on the screen. Recovered archives are carefully documented and deposited in collections maintained by universities, libraries, and independent preservation organisations. Each recovered board is catalogued, its dates noted, its participants counted, its content indexed. Not everything can be shared publicly. Some archives contain private messages never meant for other eyes. The archivists make difficult decisions about what to preserve for history and what to protect for the individuals who created it. Oral history projects have begun alongside the physical recovery work. Former sysops and regular users are interviewed about their experience of the modern world, what it felt like, what mattered, what they still remember after all these years. The answers are often deeply felt. People describe those boards the way others describe their hometown, a place they came from, that shaped who they became, that no longer exists in any form they can visit. The people interviewed often have not spoken about their modern world years in a long time. They tend to start carefully. Names, dates, technical details. But within a few minutes the tone changes. They begin to talk about specific conversations, specific relationships, specific boards that felt like home in a way no physical place quite did. The emotional memory of the modern world is remarkably intact, even after 3 decades. One of the most significant ongoing archival projects has recovered material from several thousand boards. Millions of messages, tens of thousands of files, communities spanning dozens of countries. It is one of the most complete records of pre-web internet culture in existence, and it represents only a fraction of what was out there. The researchers estimate the majority of the modern world's content is gone beyond recovery. This is what remains. What the recovered archives reveal is a world more sophisticated than most people assume. The conversations are articulate, searching and modern in their concerns. People debating the nature of privacy in a networked world in 1989. People arguing about the ethics of software sharing in 1991. People building international community networks with no corporate backing and no institutional permission. The problems they were working on are the same problems we are still working on today. There are moments of tenderness in the recovered archives that are startling to encounter. A message posted late at night by someone who had found, through a modem board, the first community that made them feel understood. A reply from a stranger that said exactly the right thing. These interactions were invisible to the outside world. They were real. They mattered to the people who had them. Most of it is gone. What remains is only the fragment that happened to survive by chance. The modern world raises a question with no comfortable answer. We tend to assume that digital records are permanent, that what is stored online will remain accessible indefinitely. The modern world suggests otherwise. An entire civilization of communication and community existed for 15 years, then disappeared within a decade, leaving almost no trace. Not because anyone chose to destroy it, simply because no one chose, in time, to save it. The digital preservation community calls this the dark archive problem. For most of human history, knowledge was lost through deliberate destruction. But in the modern world, the loss was entirely passive. No one erased those boards. They simply stopped being maintained. And in the absence of maintenance, digital content reverts to silence faster than almost any other medium. The darkness does not have to be chosen, it only has to be permitted. Every community that exists online today is, in some sense, building on ground that has already been lost before. The researchers who dig through old drives are not motivated primarily by nostalgia. They are motivated by the same impulse that drives any archaeologist. The conviction that what people did and said and made and felt deeply is worth remembering, even when the world has moved on, even when the platforms have changed, even when the conversations have long since fallen silent. Every human community leaves traces. These traces are worth finding. The work continues. New volunteers join every year, drawn by the combination of technical challenge and historical meaning. Old machines are repaired and put back into service. Dusty drives are carefully imaged, their contents copied to modern formats before the magnetic particles lose their final alignment. It is slow, painstaking, and often disappointing work. And occasionally it yields something that has not been seen for 30 years. Somewhere, in a box in a closet, there are drives that no one has looked at yet. The modern world is gone, but it was real. The people who spent their evenings in those glowing text interfaces were doing something that mattered, building community, sharing knowledge, finding each other across distances that had been impassable. Their conversations are mostly beyond recovery now, but the fact that those conversations happened, that those communities existed, that those connections were made, that cannot be erased. It is simply history most of us have not yet read. If you are watching this, you are part of a digital community. What you build here will not last forever. Nothing does. The question is not whether it will survive, but whether someone someday will think it was worth finding out what you did together and why it mattered. The modern world did not know it was building something worth remembering, and it was. Where you are building now, so are you.